Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual panel discussion on growing Atlantic Canada's aquaculture industry. My name is Lindsay Baird, and I am a business development manager at McInnes Cooper. I would like to take this time to introduce our speakers today. Peter MacKay will be moderating our discussion. Peter is counsel at McInnes Cooper, having served in the Parliament of Canada for over 18 years as a cabinet minister in high-profile portfolios, including Justice and Attorney General, Department of National Defence, Foreign Affairs, and the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. Leveraging his public service and legal experience, Peter collaborates with McInnes Cooper professionals to bring strategic value to business and public sector leaders within and outside of Atlantic Canada. Our panelists today include Tim Kennedy, President and CEO of the Canadian Aquaculture Industry Alliance. Tim brings a wealth of strategic and leadership experience in the nonprofit, government, and corporate sectors. After a long period of time working in the nonprofit sector and as an advisor to the official opposition in Ottawa, he worked for 10 years as a senior government relations consultant, advising clients in the natural resources and sustainability sectors. Before being named in 2011 as Vice President, Government and Aboriginal Affairs for Spectra Energy, a Houston-based energy pipeline and delivery company. Tim served in this position for 6 years until beginning his role with the Canadian Aquaculture Industry Alliance in April 2017. We also have Alex Templeton on our panel today. Alex is a partner at McInnes Cooper, and he maintains a litigation and regulatory practice, which includes focus on aquaculture together with administrative law, environmental law, natural resources, and energy and electricity projects. He regularly represents public institutions and private companies in a variety of industry sectors. He has appeared and argued at all levels of court in Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada, including the Supreme Court of Canada. And for our final panelist, we have Mike Sims. Mike is a member of the firm's board of directors here at McInnes Cooper and a partner in our Halifax office. Mike has extensive commercial and regulatory experience in natural resources, environmental matters, and energy. Mike has worked on numerous complex natural resources projects, including large-scale aquaculture projects, renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, forestry, and offshore and onshore oil and gas projects. Now, I'd like to review some housekeeping items before we start our discussion. So all mics will be muted during the session. However, you can contribute to today's discussion by sending us questions via the questions text box, and we can discuss those after our presentation. So you'll find this feature on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of you as possible. However, we do encourage you to reach out to a lawyer in your region after our session if we haven't answered your question. Peter, over to you.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And gentlemen, Alex, Tim, Michael, looking forward to our discussion today. It's a timely one, and one, of course, that has significant economic impact right across the country. And we are well represented here by the panel. So let's get right to some of the discussion. The first question deals specifically with the challenges, and I like to pose this question in a positive rather than a negative. But what are the opportunities, challenges, and perhaps some of the impediments that exist for aquaculture growth? That is, the potential being further realized on both coasts and in the Arctic as well. And maybe Tim, you can start us off on that point.
Thanks, Peter, and great to be here. Thanks to McInnes Cooper for your invitation, kind invitation. Maybe I'll just start. I'm thinking that most of the audience knows, I think, the opportunities for aquaculture, but I think it's good to just sort of lay the groundwork there. So, the UN numbers, 7 to 10% per, growth per year. One of the highest, the fastest growing food sectors in the world is seafood. Low carbon protein, lowest among sort of major animal proteins globally. And obviously in terms of coastal community development, it really is sort of the future. We also know that the wild capture fishery is kind of flat to declining going forward. There may be some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, with that demand and with the flatlining of wild capture, aquaculture really is the future. And that makes a lot of sense when we think about the food production sector more broadly. we've been farming for thousands of years, right? And producing our food that way. So this is a great opportunity for Canada, longest coastline in the world, great innovation, great people potential, and coastal communities and Indigenous communities that are really, I think, very interested in this sort of opportunity. To your question, Peter, about I think responding or the challenge, I obviously am very focused on the federal government with the National Association. I work with colleagues in Atlantic Canada who I think are all on the call. Mark Lane in Newfoundland, Tom Smith in Nova Scotia, and Sue Farquharson in New Brunswick. Great team, but I think what I wanted to bring to the table today is the ongoing and very long-standing challenge of the problem of the federal government not having an appropriate economic framework to develop aquaculture in this country. So while the provinces, for instance, in Atlantic Canada may support explicitly the development of aquaculture, for instance, salmon farming, it's very mixed at the federal level. And that mix is causing a lot of resistance and a lot of questions. There is a lack of confidence in the federal system about standing up for the sector. We've seen this very recently and I think very, in a sense, tragically in the last year, with the decision from the former Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, Bernadette Jordan, in the Discovery Islands in British Columbia, where the decision was, she explicitly said, was not based on science. It was a lack of what she called social acceptability, which was a new term. And I know we can get more into this as the conversation goes on, but I do think the long-standing challenge is that we do not have a central department in Ottawa that explicitly is given the mandate to champion the growth of aquaculture in this country. So if there was one thing that was a major impediment, and it's sort of that a very macro framework issue, it's that we don't have that in Canada. And I'll just end by saying, again, I think most people on this call will know the example of Norway very well, but Norway 40 years ago, 50 years ago now, made a decision that they wanted to create jobs in communities that were otherwise really struggling with the demise of wild capture fishery and traditional ways of making developing economies. And they turned to aquaculture, in a sense, as a way that they could create jobs, invest in innovation, and do it right. And I guess the question that we need to ask is Canada and the federal government willing to continue on the path to say, yes, we can and must do this, as opposed to always, back and forth about whether we should or whether we shouldn't? We need to do this. We need to develop our aquaculture sectors, and we can do it, but we have to do it together, and we need a strong proponent and supporter in Ottawa to do that.
Thanks very much, Tim. And I want to bring Mike in on that point. And there seems to be a number of inflection points here. There's the offshore, there is, of course, inshore fishery, there's the aquaculture wild, but there's also, of course, this issue around jurisdictions. And you alluded to the federal government's role, and maybe I'll get Mike and Alex to talk a little bit about that, the role of federal provincial governments, not only the jurisdictional one, but striking that balance and how they become enablers, rather than, I think the perception very often is that it has created a bit of a bureaucratic malaise that has not allowed the potential that we're speaking of here to be reached. So maybe I'll turn it over to you first, Michael.
Thanks, Peter. I might use a different M word. I'd say morass.
Morass, okay.
Malaise too, but from a jurisdictional point of view, it's very unclear. If you go back to first principles or a constitutional law 101, fish and seawater, to greatly oversimplify things, are in the federal jurisdiction. And there was a case in BC not that long ago that confirmed that fish farming is a federal matter for the most part. Of course, many of the bays that fish farming happen in are within the province that they're located in. So there's an intersection there that is unclear. that is unexplored in a lot of ways, and neither the feds nor the provinces really want to seem to want to sort it out. And you see this exact same sort of issue in pure environmental law. Of course, the framers of the Constitution didn't turn their minds to who has jurisdiction over the environment back in 1867. And so you get a very similar kind of awkward overlap between federal jurisdiction and provincial jurisdiction. And my answer to that is we're not going to fix the Constitution with respect to jurisdiction over inshore fish farming. That's kind of like where we were in oil and gas a number of years ago, offshore oil and gas. And it took a lot of money and a lot of wrangling to get to kind of a truce on that. I'm not suggesting that anyone wants to go down that path for the fisheries, but I think my point is that there is an appropriate role both for the feds and for the relevant provinces to properly and efficiently regulate inshore fish farming. And there's some talk about, well, a Federal Fisheries Act would solve everything. I'm not sure I subscribe to that point of view. Really, if you had to twist my arm and ask me what the single biggest issue facing aquaculture is, it's public acceptance and perception. And I don't think that's solved by removing or distancing the decision maker / regulator to a central kind of authority like DFO. There is probably an appropriate role for provincial regulators, properly formatted, and by way of example, I think Nova Scotia, after the Leahy-Dole report, has done some really innovative things with respect to regulation. So I think we're going to wind up, we should wind up in a place where there is a role for the feds and for the province to play in the regulatory sphere. But both of those bodies have to do everything they can to simplify, to streamline, to avoid overlap and duplication, and even worse, conflict between the requirements of the two regulatory bodies.
That's a great answer, Mike, and it does open up some other areas for discussion around jurisdiction legislation, of course, whether it be new legislation or amendments. And Tim, of course, mentioned court decisions and the precedents that they can very often set. ESG has become such a big consideration. It's prominent in so much of our daily lives now, and the decisions that are being made by all levels of government. Alex, maybe just a point that Mike alluded to, and that is government's role, all government's role, in the perceptions, or perhaps to put another way, dispelling misperceptions about aquaculture. And I can't help but cite the obvious example of what we're seeing right now around vaccines. And government has been very forward-leaning for obvious reasons in terms of encouraging people on the vaccine file. What about in support of the industry, government's role in terms of addressing some of the still misperceptions and myths about aquaculture?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and really is a part of is a piece to the overall puzzle, I think, of unlocking the true potential of the opportunity that aquaculture represents to the country at large and to Atlantic Canada in particular. From my perspective, I deal in the litigation role, regulatory role. So, I tend to see a lot of activity at the ground level, practically. And, one of the things that I'm seeing is, there are tools available to government as, custodian of a lot of information, obviously, that comes into their possession as a regulator. from proponents of aquaculture projects or operators of projects. In terms of the access to information legislation that's out there, there are exceptions in there that are fairly well calibrated to the aquaculture industry as it is to general industry at large. But that said, we have seen criticisms of some of those as well. Typically, protections that are supposed to be in place to protect industry against harm that would arise from disclosure of information outside of context or without the opportunity for some form of fulsome explanation. And so there is at least a bit of recognition that perhaps there is some tightening of the screws that needs to be done with some of the access to information legislation. The other thing that we've seen is that people are starting to suggest that there's more that could be done for the aquaculture industry in particular in this regard. That it is about social acceptability. That that is really, if I were to pick what is one of the major issues that the industry is facing, I mean that would be in the top 5 for sure. And it's about disseminating information in a planned manner of reporting. So what we see when we compare, for example, to the transportation industry in Canada or some of the energy sectors in Canada, in Newfoundland, I'm making the comparison all the time to the offshore oil and gas sector that we have here in the province. And what we see is a much more constrained dissemination of information through the application of specialized legislative privileges that act as sort of umbrella protections, not sort of wholly withholding information from the public, but actually ensuring that there's at least an umbrella of confidentiality as between industry and the regulator to provide for this open, transparent, free flow of information as between the entities, and then with the idea that information will be shared with the public in a controlled manner when things have been sort of investigated, considered, plans have been made, and then disseminated to the public. So there isn't as much of this just sort of open the books and allow the public to draw their own conclusions. Typically, that's happening completely devoid of context, which matters.
I'm going to come back to some of the things you mentioned, but Tim, just on that subject matter of the role of the government to help bring about social acceptability, and is there lessons that can be learned from the East-West divide that sometimes is accentuated? It's hard. It's hard in many areas of public policy to get a uniform approach across a country as diverse as our own. But even the subject matter of having separate departments of fisheries and oceans for the East and the West Coast has been discussed in the past, as has the movement of the aquaculture subject in and out of agriculture, for example, and back to fisheries. But a little bit of the West Coast perspective, perhaps, and lessons learned that perhaps we should be looking at here on the East Coast.
Thanks, Peter. I agree with what Alex said. I mean, I think that the key thing, or I think Mike said this too, is social license, whatever you want to call it, and the minister recently called it social acceptability, so that was sort of a new term. But look, I think when we look at the issue of social acceptability, you have to ask, well, what does that mean, right? And it is a perception issue, and the perception issue is based typically in the understanding that aquaculture is somehow damaging the natural environment. So it is a science issue. And to your question about how the government can, its appropriate role, I would say one major weakness is that DFO is our regulator in parts of the country, a principal regulator, secondary regulator, and they are the keepers of science. They do a huge amount of science. And this gets back a little bit to what I was saying about being the proponent. We need a proponent because DFO, I think, sees itself as a neutral arbiter. But if we want to develop the sector, DFO has to be able to speak up very actively and effectively about the science that they have that says that there is less than minimal impact on the environment for our operations. And where there is potential or greater risk, well, let's talk about that, and the industry will respond. But what we have right now is we have this huge amount of information that's not communicated by anybody, and industry can't do it. Industry has no reputational ability to do that, nor should we. It's the regulator that has to step up and speak out, and they're not doing that. And that's exactly, I think it connects to the challenge that I mentioned first, which is if you have an economic proponent and you have a desire to develop the sector in a real way, then you have to be able to speak about the foundations of that development, which is science. And you have to, it's a difficult area, as you just said, it's a very difficult thing to do, but it has to be done.
And Tim, just to not to belabor the point too much, but you mentioned the Discovery Islands decision. You've mentioned the minister's new sort of nuanced language, and we see these type of new precedents, as I mentioned, and decisions coming from the courts that inject what we would hope would be clarity, but it sometimes leads to even greater misunderstanding or confusion within the industry. We've seen it in many different sectors, and what consultation means, for example, and how this can lead to prolonged malaise again for industry. But if not the minister, then who? And if not industry, then who? Where do we go to get that clarity and certainty that appears to be so elusive for the industry?
It's a great question. And I think Mike and Alex might have some comments on this too. Again, there is a rebuilding process, I think, for DFO. DFO, I think, on both coasts has challenges with its own reputation, and I think it has an amazing amount of experts engaged, and there are outside experts as well that can be brought in. I think we could look at sort of more independent panels for assessment. I think they do that in Nova Scotia, or I know they do that in Nova Scotia for assessing new projects. Those are all opportunities, and I think great possibilities. But I would say, when it comes down to the confusion that's going on, I'll just go back. So what we saw in British Columbia around this so-called definition of social acceptability, or lack of definition, was that it was an expansive consultation with many First Nations in a particular area. It was not meaningful consultation, because a number of those nations came out afterwards and said, actually, we weren't really consulted on this, so the minister did not really hear us. So you have that, but then the concerns being expressed by the nations themselves are based on science concerns. And yet the minister said, this has nothing to do with science. So the confusion, as we all know, this has to be addressed. We have to have a strong regulator. We need to have, we need to have, a government at the same time. And some would say this is a conflict, but I think it can be worked out. Other countries have done it, that a government that actually supports long-term the development and growth of the sector in Canada.
And so at the risk of, and this is not a partisan comment, but it sounds like political leadership is needed, and clarity in communications. And sometimes communications is the most difficult part of all of this. But Mike, turning it back to the subject that you touched on earlier in your remarks, and that is, if not a new act, then what about, and this is just a suggestion, the convening of, almost a provincial, federal, national conference of some sorts to bring these various discussions to a point of, if not greater clarity, then at least a clear assignment of divisions of responsibility, and maybe even determining the necessity of what new legislation would look like. Where are the gaps? Because we're not talking about regulating outer space or getting into a very technical discussion. These are questions that have been around and certainly been with us and with the industry for some time now. So, what we're looking for in this discussion is where's the path? Where do we get to that better place for those who are struggling mightily sometimes in the industry?
So thanks, Peter. That's a really good good question, and it's a challenging one. And as I said before, both the federal government and the provincial government have a role to play. But linking back to Tim's comment a moment ago, social acceptance or social license can be a bit of a cop-out in decision making, to be honest, right? Part of government's role, part of a regulator's role, is to get the right information out there into the hands of the people, to provide opportunities for the public's voice to be heard in an orderly manner, provide opportunity to get to vet the issues and to have them dealt with in an organized way. And to just say there's no social license, that almost, puts the cart before the horse. You can't have social license in a vacuum, right? Social license is built on solid information, solid science, transparency, not absolute transparency in everything, but transparency in the decision-making process, decisions that follow from reasons, follow from information that was provided, so that when a decision is made, it's understood in its proper context. And so I'm a big fan of independent regulatory boards. I think they worked fantastically well for the most part in the offshore. Here in Nova Scotia, our Utility and Review Board is another example of an adjudicative board that has worked very well and very independently from government for a long time. They put out, coherent written decisions, receive evidence, and anyone who's gone through a hearing with that board or read their decisions can see how they got there. I think, and Nova Scotia has gone down this road already to a great extent with the Aquaculture Review Board here. That's a very young board. It only has one reported decision with another one on the way, but that can be a very powerful tool. And whether that's a joint federal provincial board or more like the Nova Scotia model, I could see both paths. I don't think there's a right answer there. The right answer is really about the independence of that board, and those boards need to fiercely protect their independence and be apolitical and evidence-based.
Tim, Alex, maybe you could touch a little bit on the issues that, of course, stem from the environmental protection evolution. ESG is more of the public perception and efforts to keep pace with more equitable treatment of various sectors. But the environmental protection evolution, and I'll come to you as well, Tim, has resulted in litigation, has resulted in real conflict at times that has not necessarily clarified that path and that journey that we're discussing here. But how do we make a more complementary and more cooperative approach emerge out of the environmental protection legislation and evolution that we have seen in concert with the development of the aquaculture industry, as opposed to in conflict?
Yeah, so boy, there's a lot that you could touch on there. What instantly comes to mind for me is that it's, again, I sort of come at this from a very practical perspective. Clients that have, issues that engage these matters and engage them in court. It's less so from my perspective about, the collaborative approach that's going on, and the fact that, a lot of decision making is science-based. My experience with industry is that they are tremendous environmental stewards. They are constantly trying to, create even more sustainable practices and environmentally responsible practices and integrate them into their operations. Where I see the disconnect coming oftentimes is, the extent of the regulatory ask on them is quite high. And, if we're talking about decisions that are either science-based or alternatively, if they are, about public acceptance and social acceptability, as the term is being raised, one of the things that we see a lot here now is the sufficiency of the reasons that are coming from the authorities that are, issuing these authorizations. And I think that's sort of a critical piece, an immediate piece that of the puzzle that can be actioned. There was a decision of the Supreme Court of Canada just a couple of years ago by the name of Vavilov, which sent shockwaves through the administrative law community in the sense that it touched on now judicial review of all forms of government decision making, ministerial decision making, and the issue that we see the court sort of refining here is that they are particularly focused on this idea that in Canada we need to better promote a culture of justification of our government decisions. We need decisions that are clear and cogent and intelligible and transparent. And what we're seeing in decisions now is it's not so much that decisions are not aligning with industry at times, but it's actually the ability to defend those decisions in terms of outlining what were the reasons that brought, a minister or some other government official to the end conclusion of where they are. And it's not just a matter of the reasonableness of that end conclusion, but it's the steps, the logical steps of reasoning that got them to that outcome that are critical. So, if we're to take that away and say, well, where do we go with that? What can we do to sort of promote greater confidence in the industry around these issues? My suggestion would be, for people that are sort of internal to government, it is a matter of taking that second look and saying, okay, this is the decision we want to render. Is it intelligible? In the authorization letter that we're going to send out to this proponent, is it clear there that they can discern, here are the issues that arose and here's how we decided those issues? And if it's not clear, I'd suggest vetting those decisions by legal advisors, the Department of Justice, or if you have the opportunity to go external, vet your decisions with the idea that of reading it from an intelligibility perspective with Vavilov in mind. Same thing externally. If you're a proponent or an operator at an aquaculture facility, and there's an authorization pending that is going to be critical to your operations, ask at that last hour for the regulator to issue a draft of it to you so that you can vet it through legal again with that idea of the intelligibility. Try to create, a greater degree of confidence around, how watertight these decisions will be that are so critical to the industry.
That's a great point, Alex, and intelligibility should be, you would hope, one of the considerations for any correspondence that's going out to any industry or to Canadians more broadly. And, this is my commentary, but, sadly, we almost need translators sometimes when we're in conversation with our own government. And I'm not talking about French-English translation, I'm talking about government linguistics that don't give clear direction or clear answer to industry, and that I think causes enormous frustration. Putting that aside, Tim, at a very practical level, and I want to turn to some of the questions now that we're getting from those on the line, but your thoughts, having worked in and around this industry for many years, where do you see some of the potential for increased productivity and production? What species, for example? We know that Arctic char has become a very in-demand product from Canada. And I guess, what are the jurisdictions for the markets? Where do you see the greater potential for Canadian aquaculture far from our shores, where we're going to be able to meet demand, get that product to market, and what species would you see as perhaps creating that greatest potential?
It's a good question, Peter. Thanks. Maybe just a quick description of aquaculture in Canada can be helpful for the audience, and that is,
Absolutely.
I'd say about 85. It's very close to 85% of the economic value of the current aquaculture sector in Canada is Atlantic salmon. Okay, so it's about 15% for shellfish, other fish species. So salmon is king, and you know, by far. And I would say also that we saw that through the COVID period, is that you know, we have some members who have said that they saw a 300% increase in major retailers for salmon in particular, right? So fresh fish, which is a huge advantage for Canada, is the freshness of the product. So there's certainly other species. We're seeing some real interest in seaweeds development. I think the challenge for seaweed is sort of building more of a market in North America. It's not a familiar, you know, it's not familiar to eat seaweed or consume it. So a lot of that's still going into the agricultural sector. But there is a huge, you know, there's very little consumption of seaweed. So I think they've got a lot of space to grow. I'd say, as you said, Arctic char is great. There's some land-based Arctic char facilities. One of our members, Icy Waters, produces in the Yukon, so that's you know, they're doing really well. On the West Coast, sablefish, black cod, really interesting things happening with that product. And of course, there are a number of land-based initiatives going on across the country. And I will say, I did see a question earlier about sort of the land-based opportunity for Canada. And I would say to date, the land-based, and this is sort of full grow out, particularly of salmon, they're very small. You know, they're a few hundred tons when you think about total production in Canada of about 180,000 tons. You know, we're talking very, very small production, each one of them. There are a few for slightly larger facilities. I think that that's the right way to go. Globally, you're hearing about these, you know, massive potential projects of 20,000, 30,000 tons. Just let's be clear that none of those are tested. They're very early in this, in the process of proving them out, and a lot of them are failing as we're seeing. So smaller production, sort of niche production, is definitely very viable. Sort of these full grow out, large based facilities are kind of the sexy topic right now, but they're really not. You know, I think we need time to kind of see how they prove out. And also, just for Canada, those large grow out facilities, land based, if you can build them, why wouldn't you put them right beside a major market, right? Cut down your transport and other costs. So I would just be very wary about the large potential for, you know, these big, large grow out facilities. Maybe one somewhere, but not a lot. So again, our opportunity in Canada is the ocean opportunity, and it's really exciting. It's the natural environment for the fish. We're kind of trying to work with nature. We are working with nature to kind of make it work. It's challenging. We know that, especially, you know, I'll just say Newfoundland, you know, amazing environment, but also really challenging environment to grow out. So that's where we need that strong partnership and the backing of both federal and provincial governments to make it work. And there's lots we can do there.
And would it be fair to say, Tim, and I'll bring Mike and Alex into this as well, but in terms of the infrastructure investment for a land-based facility versus an inshore, we are talking about a tremendous amount of money to be up and operating, whether it's sea plants or fish product. And where does one go? And this is for the entire panel. Where does one go to engage government, I suppose, broadly, for support, funding, specific programs that will be enablers to either start up, and the startup is sometimes the most difficult part, but then to find new markets, to expand, to make those necessary investments. And I guess it goes without saying that this has all been made exponentially more challenging in the period of COVID.
So I'm going to take a slightly different tack on that, Peter. I think there's on the science side, on the technology side, there's huge opportunities to lever leverage what's happening at Cove, for example, in Halifax, the supercluster. Lots of marine-based sensing, testing that has really a natural fit for the aquaculture industry. I'd love to see the aquaculture industry and the startup industry working closely together on that sort of thing.
Mike, sorry to interrupt. Is that a bit of a one-stop shop? And maybe I'll ask Tim a little later whether there is the equivalent on the West Coast. And maybe you could just explain a little bit more about Cove itself.
Yeah, so Cove is a government-funded supercluster here in Nova Scotia that's really focused on oceans technology, written very broadly. So it is focused on the startup sector for sure, but and I think a lot of at least the early residents there, if you will, are focused on technology, sensing, testing sort of stuff. I certainly wouldn't say it's a one-stop shop. And the other thing, and I'll look across the water to Newfoundland and Alex here. One thing I think Newfoundland did really, really well in setting up its oil and gas industry was really being smart about investment in services and infrastructure and research that really enhance the value of the industry to the community. And I think if we're able to build out an aquaculture industry to a much greater extent here in Atlantic Canada, you will start to see spin-off benefits, not only with Cove, but also research at our post-secondary institutions, the services industry taking off, services that are then exported around the world to other aquaculture sites. So I think smart support of the industry can lead to a lot more than just the physical aquaculture sites, physically in the province. And I think one of the things that industry proponents can really do is focus on bringing additional value to the communities that they're in. And I don't mean sort of mandatory, social spending, but rather really looking to build capacity, to build skills, to build services abilities, so that the people who are in the community are seeing a benefit. They're not just a host of the industry, but rather they and their family and relatives are engaged in the industry and seeing the upsides, and not just the downside. Sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent there, Peter, but
all good. All good. Alex, from a Newfoundland perspective, where's your go-to, and how do you start up and grow? Where is the place where you're going to get the best advice, information, and perhaps even financial support?
Right. Well, just to sort of riff for a moment off of and respond to what Mike was saying there. I mean, you can just imagine the Newfoundland experience, right? And how, in a lot of ways, because of everything that aligns with aquaculture, it feels like, in some regards, to the natural answer to the cod moratorium that we had here in the 90s, right? And yes, we had the resurgence with offshore oil and gas, but it wasn't engaging that same infrastructure. It wasn't engaging the same people to the same extent. And so there's just, there's tremendous opportunity here. And we're starting to see as well, the recognition that there's obviously a huge supply chain that comes along with this activity. We see the marine base in Marystown that's being developed. And, my understanding is that there's much more to come in that manner. So it's just it's a highly encouraging development, and I think it is one that's really come of age in Newfoundland. It absolutely has its challenges, but thematically, you can see how this is that evolution from, away from hunter-gatherer and towards farmer that goes along with, that story of humanity, really. One of the things that I think that we can sort of, loop back to as well is that, it is encouraging the renewed focus that government has in terms of promoting the industry. We've been undergoing sort of an economic recovery here in Newfoundland, and as part of that, it was given, the sector was given its independent focus through what the provincial government rolled out here as their way forward plan. So there was an industry sector plan specifically for aquaculture. We've also recently had an economic recovery team that was appointed by the Premier with some very credentialed economists and businessmen and women on it to develop a plan and comment on what they saw as the future for Newfoundland. And their report that came out just earlier this year had a lot to say about, suggestions around the aquaculture industry. And I think it harkens back to what, Tim sort of said at the outset, that there are so many things that align here, but what we still seem to need is sort of a coalescence or an overall economic plan that is going to bring together all these pieces of the puzzle and figure it out. And so, I don't really have one, specific spot in mind where people could go, but just to say there's a tremendous amount of bandwidth already around, development of the aquaculture sector in Newfoundland, and so you won't be looking for very long to find the right contact.
Well, there is a tremendous body of work that is done. Mike spoke of the need for greater clarity in both legislation. We obviously want to depoliticize, and having regulatory bodies that are independent and able to provide input and advice. Tim, I'm pulling from some of the great questions and input we're getting from participants online, but drawing on your expertise, given there is so much data now and so much information available about species and the tracking of various failures and successes, what is the role that you see of that body of work in helping, again, us to shape a better future for aquaculture? We are now, so it's even beyond the science. It's ocean technology, and we seem to be making rapid advances in that ability to collect data, to predict the future more accurately. Speak a little bit about that, if you would, and the role of universities and the research that's happening around this space of aquaculture.
Peter, I'm just gonna touch on the previous question before I go to that one. So
yes,
thanks.
Please.
But I do want to say there is a lot of collaboration, I think, more than we've ever seen before between the aquaculture and wild capture sectors. So at the national level, Kaya has worked with the Fisheries Council of Canada around the concept of the blue economy. So the current government in Ottawa has announced that it wants to develop the blue economy for Canada, which is wonderful. So I'll just start there and I'll say, kudos. I think it's a good platform. We worked with the Fisheries Council of Canada to develop a blue economy strategy, which people can find online at seafoodopportunity.ca. It's a little sales pitch. But the second thing we did was we recognized very clearly, besides the champion department, which I talked about earlier, you need to have a particular structure, exactly to your point about you need a one-stop shop, right, to support the development of the sector. And to your question, we have so much information out there. How do we build this opportunity? Well, we've proposed with the Fisheries Council that a Canadian seafood development agency be structured that would be kind of a standalone, very particular structure that would focus on, the economic opportunity for Canada, would do things like supporting marketing opportunities in Canada, because of course the seafood sector is very, it's varied, and so we don't have that opportunity that other commodities have to market product, right? So think about the dairy and the beef, right? Those guys have been marketing Canadians and reaching out to them for 50 years. We don't have anything like that, right? So there are pieces that have been missing for a long time. They need to all be brought together, exactly to your point. One-stop shop, you know, an organization that can reach out and say, how can we support you, as opposed to, you know, here's a new rule that you have to follow that in fact blocks and inhibits growth. So that is absolutely critical. If it's not a seafood, it's not an agency, it's some particular structure that's formed. And I think the Blue Economy strategy provides that opportunity to actually move forward on something like that. So all that information you're talking about in your additional question can very much be wrapped into that sort of organization that can also support telling the story much more effectively.
Maybe then a question, feel free for anyone on the panel to comment. With respect to our Indigenous, our First Nation fishery, and the coexistence, the necessary cooperation and collaboration to see that we continue to work positively in that regard. Perhaps just some comments there. And I know that this is sometimes fraught with tension. It's certainly been very apparent at various times in our history. But what do you see as the the necessary path forward with respect to that coexistence within the fishery, aquaculture, perhaps wild and aquaculture?
So Peter, I can start. I think if you take a look at the pending applications in Nova Scotia, a lot of them are for First Nations proponents. And certainly with the recent acquisition of Clearwater by a coalition that involved First Nations entities as well. First Nations are all over this industry. They, I certainly won't speak for them, but they appear to understand the potential and are very, very well placed to build out the potential with others. There is unfortunate tension right now between Indigenous and non-Indigenous fishers on the East Coast, particularly in parts of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. I think that is, well, I'll be very frank, I think it's a failure of leadership at the political level, and that's an untenable position. There has to be appropriate opportunities for First Nations to exercise their fishery rights, and also for fishers, non-Indigenous fishers, to exercise their livelihood. And there's a path forward there. It's not an easy path forward. It's not a path forward that can be dictated. It's one that's I think probably going to be a little bit messy and a little bit jerky as we get there, but it has to happen, and I think it will happen, and but it's going to take some leadership and cooler heads to prevail before it's smooth.
Alex, again, it seems to be a place where there is demonstrable need for not only leadership, but clarity coming from all angles to get to that, peaceful coexistence.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree entirely. And, I'm viewing this from a bit of a distance, but to me, it's always seemed like, that tension sort of suggests it's a zero-sum game, and it's not a zero-sum game. There's so much opportunity for growth here and collaboration. We are, and there's positive instances of that collaboration. And on the consultation front, I think again, it's just a matter of the certainty that goes along with that, right? We want, I don't see a lot of proponents that are contrary to consultation. They just want to be sure that at the end of the day, once that phase is complete, that it is complete and they're able to move forward after that point. I think it's the lack of clarity around that brings industry the most discomfort.
Tim, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we've been doing a lot of work in the last couple of years at the national association level to partner with Indigenous people, both partners in the business, but also who are just interested in aquaculture. So we're kind of moving forward to formalizing that more. Certainly deepening of relationships all across the country with Indigenous people, with First Nations are absolutely critical for the future of the sector. And we're certainly seeing on the West Coast in particular some some ownership, license ownership of and transfer of ownership to some nations where that's of interest. But a lot of nations, of course, there's a variety of approaches. And a lot of nations want different types of agreements and benefit agreements. So what's interesting is what I'm seeing is the listening that's going on in our sector right across the country. So it's really, the big shift is from sort of saying industry knows best, right, to actually, going to meetings and saying, tell us what your needs are, like tell us what you need from us, tell us how we can support you. And I think that's a really positive thing, and something that we're excited about across the country. So again, those deepened relationships, but meaningful, right? So I don't want to pay lip service to it. We know that there's a lot of discussion around that, but I think very practical steps are being taken to to build the reconciliation that so many people are wanting these days.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you all very much. We're getting right down to the wire now, and there's still some terrific questions, some dealing with the certification process, others, again, questions about markets and certain species. What I will endeavor to do is see that we're able to at least try to get back to some of those participants who have submitted questions. But just as a wrap up, perhaps this is the short snapper portion of our program. What would you suggest is one thing, if there was one thing that could be done to move the industry forward, one recommendation, and we've talked about a lot of them here, but what would you suggest is one major step forward that we could take with respect to seeing greater prosperity and activity and safe coexistence within the aquaculture industry? Michael, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Peter. I think the biggest thing is modernizing and streamlining the regulatory process. It's avoiding duplication. It's recognizing that there is that assessment of environmental impact is necessary, but that doesn't necessarily mean an environmental impact assessment. That is to say, when a site is licensed, the environmental impacts have to be assessed and considered and mitigated, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the appropriate way to do that is with the large semi-truck or dump truck of an environmental assessment, when what is really needed and what is best positioned to get to the right answer is something far more light and nimble.
Wonderful. Alex, and I know it's difficult to say one thing, but just your perception.
Well, yeah, no, I was just going to say, I mean, I agree with everything that Mike just said. And from my perspective, there are so many issues that aren't going to be resolved overnight. So I would just say, tightening the screws on the legislation that is in place, making sure that it works for industry. And then I just go back to that clear, reasoned decision making, I think is so critical to the industry and to developing confidence and progress forward.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Alex. Tim, last word to you.
I'm so glad I'm on this call with very practical lawyers, because mine is goes back to the very first thing I said, which is, again, formalizing that champion department and building the supportive structure for actually seeing the growth of aquaculture across the country.
Well, those are all great, tangible, thoughtful answers, and my takeaway would be more discussion, more public engagement, which is very much at the root of what we've been doing here today. And so I thank all of our panelists, Alex, Tim, and Mike, and to everyone who has participated. It is our hope that you were able to glean some useful information from this afternoon's chat. And we hope to do so again. And I'll turn it back to you, Lindsay. And I think you're going to tell us that this discussion will be available to those who might also like to watch it again, or those who perhaps were unable to join us today. So back to you, Lindsay.
Absolutely. We will be providing a recording of our discussion today. And that's it for us. Thank you so much for joining. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.